Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our next live stream. I'll be your producer for this session. Before we start, I do have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional, and on topic. Keep an eye on that chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenters to answer live. Our session is being recorded. It will be available to view on demand right here on the Reactor channel. With that, I'd love to turn it over to our speakers for today. Thank you for joining.
Hello, hello, hello. Here we are.
Hi, everyone.
How are you? How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Looking forward to talking about some of this stuff with you today.
We have a long/short hour ahead with a ton of context to deliver here in this session. So we better start, right?
Yeah, let's get to it.
So today we're going to be talking about the DP-800 series, right? How to get certified. And the topic will be secure, optimized, and ship SQL Server solutions with confidence. A little bit about myself. I am Javier Villegas from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'm Microsoft MVP in the data platform award area, and I'm also Microsoft certified trainer. I'm one of the organizers of our local community, SQL Argentina, in where we have our shows and we have a lot of fun together. So Chris.
Yeah, this is me. I'm Chris Hyde. My pronouns are he, him. I'm in the Dallas area today where it is warm and humid, and we're going to have some torrential rain this afternoon. So looking forward to that. But yeah, everyone, let us know in the chat where you're from. It's a good icebreaker. But yeah, also because you've got the chat, we need to have some moderators. So Javi, do you want to, looks like I'm jumping ahead of myself. So let's talk a little bit about this being part of a series. We'll keep you in suspense about the moderators for a second.
They are there and they are awesome, by the way. So, this is a series of episodes, right? We're aware that it's already started. There was a lot of engagement. Community data professionals seems to have a lot of excitement around this new DP-800 certification that, as you may or may not know, it was in beta until not so long ago, right? So now it's in full GA. So today we are part of the 4th episode, right? As I said, secure, optimized, and ship SQL solution with confidence. Also here you have the QR code and the link to follow the whole session. So register and make sure that you stay with us today and also participate in the next one. We have the SQL user panel, right? Chris, is a good initiative that we are seeing everywhere, a lot of engagement as well. So if you are part of the SQL community, if you work with SQL Server as a data architect, as a developer, as a DBA, please join the SQL user panel, right? And you're going to be able to influence on the SQL roadmap, right? And make sure that you interact with other professionals with your own interest in, and of course, have a lot of fun, right? Same for the Azure Data User Group, right? There are a bunch of groups around the globe, right? As I said, I'm part of the one here in Latin America, in Argentina. So if you want to join a community and Azure Data User Group, again, QR code here, link, and make sure that you join one close to where you live. And Chris, I know that you are aware that we have a new data days event coming really, really soon. We really need to thank Microsoft because, they're putting a lot of efforts on delivering all these sessions. And, every single month we have a ton of contents available. So if you want to stay updated on the news when those events are coming, right? aka.ms/datadays, or just scan the QR code. And now, Chris, we're reaching to our awesome moderators, right?
All right.
They're going to be with us together in the YouTube channel. So please, please, please do engage with them. Let's make it fun and interactive. All right?
Yeah, so who have we got today? We've got Olajide joining us from Lagos, and we've got Jeff joining us from Las Vegas, Nevada. So I want everyone in the chat, give them your toughest questions focused on SQL 800. Let's really test the two of them today, put them through the paces. Of course, I say that, but anything they can't answer, they'll just pass on to Javi and myself. So I've really kind of set the two of us up, to look bad there. But just, get in the chat, ask your questions. Let's make this as interactive as possible. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, good. So they are there for you guys. So go ahead and ask all your questions. So here is what we're going to be covering today, right? We're going to talk about implement data security and compliance with SQL, optimize database performance. This is the one I love the most. Implementing CI/CD with SQL database projects, and also integrate SQL solutions with Azure services, right? And, the objective is, of course, targeting to this new SQL+AI Developer Associate certification, right? This one is really aimed at experienced SQL Server professionals who are moving into the world in where databases and AI are not longer separate things, right? So we see that SQL Server 2025 is fully packaged of AI features. So at the core of this exam is about designing and building database solutions across SQL Server, Azure SQL, SQL Database in Fabric, right? So, the Microsoft SQL ecosystem.
And I think, one important bit to note here is, like you're saying, it's across the whole piece of the ecosystem. So it's, on-premises SQL Server, SQL database in Azure, even SQL databases in Fabric now. And a lot of times we've got the same concept, but they might be implemented in a different way. Like auditing, I'm looking at you specifically. The concept of auditing is going to be the same in all the places, but the implementation is very different. So for the exam, you're really going to have to be able to take the concept and be able to apply it to each of the three platforms.
And you may have to think about that if you want to take this exam. Microsoft assumes that you understand the basic concepts of AI, right? Like embeddings, vectors, models, right? So this is super important for you to start. Another thing to consider here is that, we mentioned in the agenda at the beginning, CI/CD using GitHub, right, is a very important topic on the exam, and it will be evaluated with several questions, right? We have seen it when we took ours, and there is, AI, of course, T-SQL performance, but also CI/CD, which in these days is super important when you work with the database project, right? So there are three main domains that are on this exam. Design and develop AI capabilities, right? and implement data security and compliance. And that's the one that we're going to be focusing on today, right? This is the second pillar of the exam, which is super important. And, we covered the number one before, and we will cover, in another session, the implementing AI capabilities, it will be covered as well.
Yeah,
something to bear in mind. Yeah, go ahead,
yeah,
Chris.
I was going to say one thing to note for everyone watching is like you look at the box we're talking about today, and there's not really any AI in there. So for the folks that are maybe a little nervous to take this exam because you're not up to speed on the AI yet, don't be worried about that. That's just like a portion, maybe a third of the exam. Like 2/3 of the exam are building on those solid SQL developer and SQL Server administration skills that a lot of you may already have. So this is sort of just taking like what you've already been doing with your career and adding that little AI sauce on top, so that you're ready for sort of the next generation of the SQL product.
Yeah, and definitely have good skills in T-SQL, right? This is super important in all the areas. Doesn't matter if you are designing a database solution, if you are implementing security, or even implementing AI capabilities. T-SQL is definitely this layer that cross everything, because it's the language, the tool that we use all the time in SQL Server.
Yep.
Something important is like many of the Microsoft exams, you will have 100 minutes, right? And a passing score of 700 out of 1,000, right? So that doesn't matter that if you answer 70% of the question, you are good. No, each of the questions may have different weight in the final score, the final result, right? There is also a dedicated session for that at the end on how to pass the exam. But yes, just for you to know at this point, all right? So let's go together into the 6 core learning objectives that we have today. First of all, we're going to be talking about implementing data security measures, including always encrypted, column-level encryption, dynamic data masking, row-level security, and to protect sensitive data meeting with compliance requirements. Second, will we design a secure access pattern using passwordless authentication? This is the trend in SQL. Try to go passwordless everywhere, right? Also using managed identity for service-to-service communication and secure REST and GraphQL endpoints. Third, we will be optimizing database performance by choosing the right service tier, analyzing queries with their execution plan, dynamic management view, and of course, relying on Query Store for historical performance tracking. Fourth, we're going to be diagnosing and resolving blocking at deadlock, also using DMVs and extended event. Fifth, we're going to implement CI/CD pipeline for database deployment using database project with source control and branch strategies. And finally, we will integrate SQL solutions with Azure services to build REST and GraphQL's API using Data API Builder, right? If you haven't seen Data API Builder, is one of my favorite tools these days. If you work with data integration, have you tried, Chris?
I haven't tried it yet. My clients are keeping me super busy.
Yes, really.
Yeah, hopefully they don't find out I took an hour off to talk to you.
All right. So let's start with implement data security and compliance with SQL Server. Chris,
yes.
The stage is yours.
All right. So I'm going to take this to start off. But before I do, I just want to emphasize, like you saw on that last slide, there was a lot of stuff, right? That's there's no way that Javi and I can cover all of that in 60 minutes, although we're going to try our best to do so. We definitely want to encourage everyone to kind of take what we're doing here today as a starting point and then go back to the Learn modules. Right, so each of these 4 kind of more detailed objectives, there's a whole module on. Those are going to take you about 2 hours. And, Javi and I get maybe 10 minutes each one. So definitely, go do those, when you can. If you just take like 30 minutes a night for each weeknight for a week, you'll get 1 module. By the end of a month, you'll have done the whole thing. So it seems like a lot, but if you break it down, you can definitely achieve it.
And also rely on the preparation guide, right? We provide the link. It's going to be also, on every single of this session. The prep guide for the DP-800 is definitely where you're going to have all the different points and the official guide to follow on the certification.
Yeah, and I know our moderator, Jeff, has a really good series about how he prepared for this exam. I think how he prepared for the beta. So I'm sure, Jeff, if you haven't dropped that link in the chat, make sure you do. I encourage everyone to go check that out. All right, so let's jump into data security and compliance. So we've got a lot of stuff. We've got encryption at multiple layers. We've got the dynamic data masking to configure. We've got row-level security, and that's ROW, not ROLE, although we will talk about ROLEs as well. And we're going to talk about, the classic object-level permissions, the famous principle of least privilege that you've heard about, and then we'll look at passwordless database access. We'll use Entra ID. We'll use the managed identities, and then we'll look at some approaches to auditing and compliance. So that is a lot to get through. But if we start with encryption, that's sort of our foundation of database security, right? Because even if our attackers get access to our underlying storage, if the sensitive information is encrypted, it's not going to be readable for them. So the different SQL platforms, we've got multiple encryption options, from protecting data at rest to securing data while it's being processed. So in understanding when to use each method, that helps us balance protection with performance, but also like the reason why you are all here is it's going to help us know the right answer on the exam, right? So let's look at the different encryption technologies available. And Javi, if you could jump ahead to the next slide, please, because I think, that shows everything all in one. So we're operating at all these different layers, solving, each one a different problem. So at the bottom, we've got transparent data encryption, TDE. So that encrypts our data at rest. So think of it as like protecting our database files on disk. That's where even if somebody has access to, the MDF files, they're not going to mean anything to them, right? And then, up a bit, we've got column level encryption, which, that's targeting specific sensitive columns like social security numbers in the US or other ID numbers. And then we have always encrypted, and that goes a little bit further by making sure that data is protected throughout its life cycle, even like while the engine is processing the queries. If you go, stay back on there for a second, Javi, please. So just to, get in a little bit different. So when we enable TDE, SQL is automatically going to encrypt our database files, and our transaction logs, and even our backups. Right, so our applications don't need any code changes because that encryption is going to happen transparently behind the scenes. So we use a database encryption key, and that's protected by a certificate that's stored in the master database. Excuse me, but column level encryption works a bit differently. So we have to be explicit to encrypt and decrypt data in our T-SQL code or application. So that's going to require us to, actually write the SQL that interacts with that. So we've, it's good because we've got really granular control about which columns. yeah, it may be bad because we've got to do that extra little coding step, right? And then always encrypted, that just keeps the encryption keys outside the database engine entirely. So it never sees our plain text data. So even our database admins with the high level access, they can't view that protected information. So if you can go back one again, please, Javi.
Here.
Yeah, here we go. Yeah, so these are like the two primary approaches for the column data. So always encrypted is a little bit stronger because everything happens on the client side, and the SQL engine never even sees, the plain text data. So, admins, cloud operators, they can't access the actual values. And we've got like a 2-key system here. So we've got a column master key, right, the CMK, and we're going to store that somewhere like a key store, like maybe Azure Key Vault or Windows certificate store locally. And then a column encryption key that's encrypted, and that's stored in the database metadata. And the combination of the two of those, we need to use it to use deterministic encryption, where we always encrypt to the same value. That lets us do joins on the encrypted columns. But if we don't need to do joins on the encrypted columns, then we'll use randomized encryption. That gives us a little bit more stronger security. And then we've got secure enclaves. These were new as of SQL 2019, which I guess, 2016 is about to roll out of the life cycle. We'll only have 2017 for one more year. So I feel like 2019 was yesterday, but sort of, as of this time next year, that's going to be the oldest, still fully supported SQL Server product. Anyway, those enclaves sort of extend the always encrypted by giving us range queries, pattern matching and then sorting as well. All right, so that's always encrypted. And I know, I covered a really deep topic in 3 minutes. So again, everybody, go back to the Learn module and kind of step through, the instructions about how to create that stuff. There's a lot of T-SQL involved. So for purposes of the exam, you're going to want to know how to, call stuff, with T-SQL to do that, to make your keys, what are the T-SQL commands, that kind of stuff. And so, column level encryption, we've got those two. It's about halfway down the column, encrypt by key and decrypt by key. So these are the T-SQL functions that you're going to implement to, obviously encrypt and decrypt, using the keys available. Yes, this is a little bit simpler, but as it says, the trust is different. So, the server can see the plain text when you're processing. So depending on your security requirements is when to know one or the other. All right.
And definitely we should know all of them, right? Because you may need to, depending on the solution that you are working on, it's going to require to mask, to hide, or also to encrypt sensitive data at rest with TDE or with always encrypted, for example, to do it end-to-end. So definitely SQL Server is giving us a ton of possibilities and options in order to do so. It's really great.
Yeah, can you jump forward one more back to the pretty diagram. Yeah, so back one more. I know Javi's really excited for me to talk about data masking, I can tell. So in terms of the exam and in terms of real life, of course, which is more important, it's always about which encryption method should you use. So it's going to come back to your requirement and your application constraints. All right, so TD is your best choice if you've got to protect data at rest. You don't want to touch your application code. always encrypted. You want to, protect the data from the database administrators, or like when the data has to stay encrypted during processing, and the column level when you need granular control over just specific columns. And so you can also, it's not like a one or the other thing. You can combine the methods. So you can have TDE for like just baseline protection of your data at rest, which is probably a pretty good practice. And then add always encrypted or column level on top of that for kind of an extra layer of security for specific columns. All right, now we can talk about data masking, or DDM. So these are a series of basically 4 functions where we can control what the users can see, but we're not changing the way the data is stored underneath. So we might put these on when we create the table for the first time. We're defining the column that way, or we can go back and use an alter table to add that masking to a specific column. So the 4 types you've got to know are right here. So as a default, so that just makes like a text string will look like XXXX. And a numeric value will show up as a 0, and a date value will show up as January the 1st, 1900. So that's okay. We might want to give a little more, something a little bit different, like the email. That'll do what you're seeing there. It'll put the X's in, but it'll still clearly read to us as an email, so that's what's stored there. You might want to use a random, so that will show up like real data, right? If I've got a column of big ints, I can set that random to be 1 to the maximum size of a big int, and it'll just show up there. So the data, when somebody's reading it, it'll look like kind of real data. It'll fit. And then we've got the more control with that partial. So you can basically say where the X's show up. You might do this for social security numbers and just show the last 4. You might do it for credit cards and just show a little portion. So I think partial definitely is the more powerful. But it's important to remember this is obfuscation, not encryption. The data is still there, so somebody who's got admin access can still read that data. You can grant unmask permission to privileged users, and they can still see the data. The data is still there and visible, and it's still in plain text. So this is a part of your security solution, for those types of sensitive columns. It's not the whole thing. All right, and then we've got row level security, which this is something I haven't really used in the database engine. I've used this a lot in the the analytics side of things. But it's basically the situation where somebody can see a table, let's say, but they can only see the rows within that table that map to their job function. So like a sales manager, she could see data from her particular region that she manages, but she wouldn't be able to see the data from the other regions. So how we do this is we create a filter predicate function, or maybe a block predicate function. The filter just lets us see what we can, limits what we can see. The block limits what we can actually do with the insert and update operations to, but we define that as a function that returns a 1 or a 0, saying whether we can give access or not. And then we bind that function to, possibly one or more table. Well, at least one, but possibly more tables into a security policy. and we can have multiple policies. And as you work through the Learn module, you get a really good example of how to do that with T-SQL. All right, let's step on. All right, so more access here. The left side is like our classic permissions that we've been dealing with in T-SQL for years and years. And I say T-SQL because that's probably how you're going to be asked about this on the exam, right? We know that you can set these in Management Studio with clicking and selecting and filling in checkboxes, but I don't think I've seen the questions.
No, I never seen one of these questions using the user interface, Management Studio, or whatever. Always using T-SQL.
Yeah. So yeah, like you may be used to managing this stuff through the GUI. Make sure make sure you know what the T-SQL scripts under there are doing. And remember, you can always script out like what you're doing in the GUI to see what that actual T-SQL wins. But really, what we're doing, I'm not sure why, but the most important piece here is on the bottom rather than the top. We want the principle of least privilege. We want to give the least amount of permissions that allow somebody to do their job.
That's the golden rule.
Yeah. So, minimum. Always remember that. But so make sure you know how to grant security. Know that, you start at the server level, which will cascade to the database, to the schema, and to the object. Make sure you know the difference between deny and revoke. That deny sort of overrides all grants that may be in place, but revoke just removes one of them. And make sure that, again, best practice here, we don't want to manage security for each of our 10,000 individual users, right? That would be awful. What we want to do is we want to create roles that align with their jobs and then assign the people to those roles so that we just manage the permissions to specific roles. We've even got some fixed ones like data reader, data writer, the two most ones that I use commonly. But we can also create our custom roles. So, if we've got, salespeople need to see specific tables, not tables in another schema, we can very easily set that up by going through the create role script and then assigning that role to a login. Login would be a particular security group and Entra ID. That security group would have all the members. And so once a member logs in, all the permissions are magically traced back through that linkage. All right. I know I've been talking a lot, so we'll just cover secure access very quickly. The important thing for the exam is to know about managed identity. That's really just our service principle. And we want to, where possible, log in only using Entra ID authentication. Yes, there are times where, usually because of like vendor requirements, we'll have to set up a server to take, both Entra ID and SQL authentication. But, the gold standard is just to use Entra ID authentication. All right, what's next? All right, and this is one of those fun things where we've got different stuff across all the platforms. So we need to make sure that we can audit, who's done what, who's looked at what data. Quite often we'll have to do the forensics of who's updated something they shouldn't have, right? So SQL Server on premises, we've got SQL Server audit. And that uses extended events to log all this stuff either to event log or to file specific files that we set up. And then Azure SQL DB has Azure SQL Auditing, which is built in, and that'll go to either blob storage or log analytics. What's not on here is the SQL database in Fabric, which has its own auditing that goes to the Fabric log analytics. So the 3 different products, 3 different places, but really we're capturing the same things. We're capturing who's the user, what did they do, what did they look at, and when did they do or look at it. And that's just going to help us meet all the data compliance regulations that we see here on the right. Javi, anything you wanted to add on that piece?
No, I mean, in terms of auditing, as you said, Public SQL DB is not in here. It's something that is super useful, especially in forensic scenario, right? When someone has to point the finger of who did what, when, SQL auditing is something that we say, oh, we haven't enabled it, right? And when your boss come to you say who did that, and you have 2 possible options. Say, oh, we have auditing, so give me a few minutes and I give you the answer, or no, I don't have anything because we don't have auditing enabled. But definitely this is a lightweight process, super useful. Of course, there are certain scenarios like financial, like healthcare, in where auditing is a must, right? No negotiation on that. But in terms of the exam itself, there are several questions pointing to the auditing and compliance part. So definitely it's a good thing that you follow the learning module and go through all these details, because it's super important.
And speaking of the exam, this next slide I think is super helpful for that. I mean, it's positioned as a security decision guide, but we can think of it as a answer the exam question guide. This just boils down to everything I've been talking about. Here's the requirement on the left side. Like if the question says something about the DBA not seeing plain text data, the answer is something to do with always encrypted. If it's each user sees only their own rows, well, that's a filter predicate in row level security.
It's a good summary of what you just described.
Yeah. So yeah, this is like the one slide, to drill into your head. And they always want the exam tip on the bottom. They always want this to come up, that remember, masking is obfuscation. It's not actually encryption. Mm-hmm. So, all right.
All right.
Yeah, it's your turn, Javi.
Yeah, let's move on to the performance part, right? So here we won't be only seeing how to, let's say, make the SQL performance, but also, which is the right Azure SQL tier that we have to select, right? This is super important because, as you know, in Azure PaaS, right, platform as a service, you may have multiple options that we will cover in a second. And one of the main benefit of the Azure platform is that you are able to scale, right, up and down. But when you do the initial setup, you have to be definitely familiar with all these service tiers and use them properly. We will also be covering something a little bit about diagnostic, right, especially on blockings and deadlock situations. So let's start. So these are the service tiers and database configuration that we have in Azure, right? We can talk about both Azure SQL DB and Azure SQL Managed Instance. The main 2 tiers are general purpose, which, as Microsoft said, is the one that should cover most of the normal workload, right? there are certain specifications that you have to be aware of, that especially the most important one is that the storage is remote, right? So you may have some minimal latency that you won't have if you choose business critical, right? That, as the name stands, is if you need to really run a critical workload in your organization, right? You will choose one of the other. Business critical use local SSD, right? And it also had built-in replicas in where you can offload your read-only workload, right? Additionally, in the Azure SQL DB world, you have the hyperscale tier, in where you can create databases with 100 plus terabyte with near instance backup, right? So these are for large amount of data, and you can even have up to 30 read replicas if you need to have this to offload again read-only workload. In Azure SQL DB world, you have also the serverless possibility, in where you can configure your databases to have auto pause, right, and auto scale. So depending on the usage pattern that you have, right, Azure SQL DB serverless can scale into resource utilization, so more CPU, and if you are not using it for certain amount of time, the service enter into auto pause, so you don't enter into additional cost spending, right? And when somebody else need to use it, it's going to automatically resume, right? This is going to be good for certain environments, like, for example, development environments, in where at the end of the day, nobody use it. So automatically, after 30 minutes, 1 hour, whatever, it goes to pause mode until the following day, when the first developer try to connect to it, right? There are also two concepts, which are the models, right? There are the initial DTU model, right, in where Microsoft tried to combine the compute power of processing and memory in a single unit that they call DTU. This DTU value also include the IOPS in the value, right? It was mainly targeted to try to predict the cost, right? So you're going to be using 10 DTUs, 20 DTUs, 100 DTUs. That's give you a little bit the amount of horsepower that you will have to process your database, and also to have control on your costs. Microsoft is trying to stay away of this original DTU model by using the vCore model, right? In where you provision the amount of CPU, memory, and storage that you need specifically for your workload. And there are certain benefits, like, for example, it's eligible for the Azure hybrid benefit, right, in where you're going to have some reduction for cost. Then, if we jump into a little bit more in-depth topic, we're going to be talking about transaction isolation levels and concurrency, right? And here there are certain important things that we need to know, because definitely they will be covered through the exams. And there are different point of view or values, depending if you are using SQL Server on-prem or if you are using Azure SQL database, because the defaults change, right? So this is the big table, the important table. Also remember it, because it's not only important for the certification, it's important when you start a new SQL project, right? In how you're going to set up the isolation level for your databases. Depending on which one you use, you will be able to do dirty reads or not, right? To minimize or escalate the blockings, etc., etc., etc. So, for example, read committed, which is the default in SQL Server, does not allow you to do dirty reading, right? and the default in Azure SQL DB is read committed snapshot, right? So take this slide, go to the learning module again. This is super important for any database professional. So when we need to do performance tuning, analyze performance in any of the SQL flavors, SQL Server on-premise, Azure SQL, SQL database on Fabric, we're going to be using the same thing. In the dynamic management view, DMVs, there are certain minimum variations depending on the platform that you use, but the core ones are the same, right? Super important that you know how to read an execution plan, right? So you know that when SQL Server has a statement, a query, a store procedure, the first thing it's going to come up with is, as quickly as possible, we'll try to come up with the best execution plan in the minimum amount of time, right? In some cases, you may enter into some regressions or certain situation in where you need to be able to read the plan, right, understand it, and take the decisions in order to improve the execution of that specific query, right? So in SQL Server, you have two execution plans, the estimated one that basically you can get it from Management Studio from any other tool, and you don't have to execute the actual query. You're going to have the estimated plan, right? With certain information that is not going to be there, because for that you have the actual plan. But in order to get the actual plan, you have to execute the statement, right? And you're going to get a very precise information on that plan. With that, we can spend several hours discussing on execution plan and how to tune it, how to fine tune it, right? But this is super important for you to have an overall view for the certification, and also if you are entering into the SQL performance. You also have the dynamic management view. You have the list here. I won't go through all of them, but there are some of them just to get the statistic on the utilization of CPU, read, write, execution count, that will help you to keep track of how many times I'm executing this specific procedure and which are the amount of reads, write, CPU utilization, 10 DB usage, etc. So that will help you to choose which are the ones that you have to prioritize in order to do fine-tuning, right? Maybe you have one that is being executed once in a while, and even if it is consuming a lot of resources, you can prioritize one that is being executed more often, for example, right? So there are other DMVs that are targeting to index utilization and missing indexes, right? Some of them are quite tricky because you definitely need to understand the indexing concept within SQL, and also important, the ones related to weight statistics. Mm-hmm. Luckily, we have query store in SQL, right? And we can have also query performance inside in Azure SQL DB. Query store is one of my favorite, I'm not sure if call it tool or feature within SQL and all the SQL flavors, because basically allow you to keep track of runtime statistics, execution plans of every single workload that is running at the top of your database, right? And with that, you can, for example, keep track of the plan history. If one specific plan, query has changed the plan over time, you have the possibility to force the plan, right? Or if you use automatic query tuning, SQL Server can do it for you, right? And also you can detect easily regress queries and take the necessary actions in order to fix them, right? In the Azure world, if you go to the Azure portal, Azure SQL DB specifically, right, you have the query performance inside, which is through the Azure portal, a dashboard with the whole health information of your database within things. You have a visual resource to consume and see all your queries, right? And you can interactive select your time range to understand what was the utilization within that specific time frame and take your decisions. And visually within the query performance inside, you can also dig into the data that is stored within Query Store. Like, as I said, runtime statistics, CPU usage, reads, write, etc., etc., etc. If we move one step forward, we also have blocking and deadlocking, which in my case, when I took the exam, there were quite a few questions related to that. I was a little bit surprised, but it's important for you to know this, again, not only for the exam, but also if you are a DBA or a developer, right? So we have to know how to detect those blockings. And for that, we have specific dynamic management views and functions that help you to do that. sys.dm exec request and sys.dm translog are the two main DMVs that will help you to keep track of your lockings if you are into a locking situation within SQL. And you can use SP-Who2 or Activity Monitor to see it in quickly, right? I will also add SP-Who's active to the top of it, which is also super powerful to keep track of blocking, right? Then, depending on something that we spoke before, on the isolation level, we can also have to make some changes to the isolation level to minimize the amount of blocks, but also we will have pros and cons, right? Like their dirty readings and those kind of things. In terms of Deadlock, right? The way I use to keep track of Deadlock is basically using extended event, right? There is a default extended event session that helps you to keep track of the deadlock. And you can also specify one tray flag 122, which will basically put all the information related to the deadlocks into the SQL error log. Not sure if this is a little bit old school or not. I ended up using extended event as my main tooling to keep track of deadlock and do the proper troubleshooting, right? And of course, if we want to prevent deadlocking, it's also related to the previous thing that we mentioned, is blocking and isolation level. So we have to make sure that we choose the right one for the workload and the type of transaction that we are working with. So Chris, we just finished this module. Anything to add here?
Extensively. That was very good.
All right, so we're running out of time, so we're gonna go through the following slide quite quickly. So Chris.
All right, yeah, so we want to put our database into a SQL database project so that we can source control it and so that we can implement CI/CD. So continuous integration, continuous development, right? If you haven't come across that before. So I know we're running low on time, so I'm going to hit the high points here, right? If we put things into a database project, whether it's a classic project or an SDK style that works across like .NET 8 and other platforms. Either case, what we're doing, we do a build and it puts all of the things that we've defined, all of our table, our view, all of our object definitions, and then any scripts that we want to run sort of after deployment, right? It produces a DAC pack with all that. Basically a compiled version of our database schema. And then when we deploy it, the tools kind of develop a change script and apply it. The great thing is that if we've got the project in one place, we're generating the same change script to go, from our local machine into our shared development, into QA, and into prod. Right. So, and we're going to source control all of this in Git. I'm not going to go into the source control and branching here just because of the time, but I do want to make sure that that just like it's been a running theme, because there's a bunch of really good GUI-based Git tools out there. And so the exam, they can't choose one. So it's got to be, using Git from the command line. Make sure you know how to do all of that stuff. And let's go to the next slide. Similarly, when we're looking at putting that into an automated pipeline to go through the build, the validate, the test, the deploy, we're actually need to know some of the YAML in order to do well on our tests. So it would take me far too long to go through all of this. I can't recommend enough going through, the module and really trying to understand, the command line and the YAML commands, because I know those are going to show up.
Yeah, definitely. We were talking before, a lot of questions related to the Git CLI, and definitely is something to recommend for you to take a look.
Yeah.
All right.
So I've left you a few minutes, Javi, for integrating the solutions.
So, the part of the data integration is the one that I love the most, right? Because, in the past, we used to use link server, SSIS packages, those kind of things to move data back and forth between systems. And now with the capabilities of REST, GraphQL, directly from SQL, and also using DAV, database, I forgot the name now, database API builder here, is the possibility that allow you to integrate, with other systems that may not be even SQL Server, right, using a JSON output with this REST endpoint. And, they are super secure in SQL because you can use Entra authentication. You can also have the role-based authentication if you need to. And, Data API Builder doesn't only support SQL. You can also go to any other database engine, right? In terms of the deployment option, how you can deploy this data API builder output, you have multiple ways to do it with Azure Static Web Apps, with container apps. You can also have it installed in your virtual machine, in Docker, or anything super, super easy. There are a lot of contents online about Data API Builder. As I said, it's super, super cool tool that nowadays I find myself using it quite often, right? In terms of monitoring and event-driven patterns, right? Azure Monitor metrics, so you can get CPU percentage, DTU percentage, storage utilization, connection, deadlock. So a lot of information that you can have directly from the portal, right? You can have, diagnostic setting string to log analytics, to Event Hub, or storage it locally. You can, define alerts rules to trigger on threshold, for example. And with Intelligent Insight, you can use AI for anomaly detection, right? You can also rely on event-driven patterns that include, for example, CDC for row-level change tracking, right? Change tracking for lightweight synchronization, and Azure Function for SQL triggering on real-time reaction. The store procedure that I also find myself using it quite a lot is SP invoke external REST endpoint, right? Which is from within SQL Server, how you can reach out to an external GraphQL or REST endpoint to get the result set in JSON and integrated with your result. Right? You know that now JSON is a first-class citizen within Microsoft SQL. So here we have a bunch of the takes away from today. We ran out of time. See the recording of this takeaway. As we said multiple times, go through the learning modules. These are definitely key for you to train for the real life on a SQL Server project and for the exam. All you need to know about the exam here is in this QR code, right? Most important thing, as we said, the study guide and do the practice hands-on labs.
Yeah, and we've got a whole session coming up about that on June 10th. Now, don't skip to that. Make sure you come back next week for the third part of the other learning objectives, and then come back on June 10th for all those tips. Sign up for the SQL panel, join an Azure data group, look for these new Data Days events coming through. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for Olajide. Thank you, Jeff, for moderating and keeping the chat moving. Thank you, Javi, for great stuff on the optimizing piece.
Was really good to share the stage with you, Chris, and the moderators. They have done an amazing job. I've been following the YouTube chat. So see you soon, and thank you so much. Bye.
See you all next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for joining, and thanks again to our speakers. This session is a part of a series. To register for future shows and watch past episodes on demand, you can follow the link on the screen or in the chat. We're always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. If you have any feedback for us, we would love to hear what you have to say. You can find that link on the screen or in the chat. And we'll see you at the next one.